Beneath Texas, 54 miles of tunnels, meant to house the world's largest science project, were left unfinished, abandoned by the very nation that funded their creation. Billions had already vanished into the earth, with American scientific dominance at stake. Yet, the Superconducting Super Collider was canceled during construction. How could the most ambitious physics project in history be so completely halted? The answer begins where intent collided with reality. In the final decades of the 20th century, America's physicists stood at the forefront of discovery. Laboratories such as Brookhaven and Fermilab had mapped the building blocks of matter. Their work fueled scientific progress and a sense of national pride. By the early 1980s, a new challenge had taken shape. The Standard Model, though powerful, left the deepest questions unanswered. What gave particles their mass? Was there a missing piece like the Higgs boson that would unlock the next chapter of understanding? To probe these mysteries, researchers argued the world needed a machine far more powerful than any before. The Department of Energy convened the Central Design Group in 1983, tasking engineers and theorists to imagine the next leap. Their answer was bold. The plan called for a proton-proton collider with a ring over 50 miles long, designed to smash particles together at 40 trillion electron volts. This was not just scientific ambition, it was a statement of leadership, born of the Cold War era's drive for American preeminence. By 1986, the Central Design Group's vision was complete, a blueprint for a collider that would keep the United States at the cutting edge and ensure that the biggest discoveries would happen on American soil. The race to host the Superconducting Super Collider drew proposals from across the country. States offered land, infrastructure, and cash incentives, each hoping to secure what was billed as the scientific project of the century. In Washington, the Texas delegation pressed its case with unusual force. Speaker of the House Jim Wright, Senator Phil Gramm, and Congressman Joe Barton joined state leaders to present a package few could rival: over $500 million in direct state appropriations, the promise of 17,000 acres donated for the site, and tens of millions more for roads, utilities, and site preparation. By November 1988, after months of technical reviews and political lobbying, the Department of Energy announced that Ellis County, south of Dallas, would be the home of the collider. The decision was more than a scientific endorsement, it was a pledge to transform rural Texas into a global center for physics. Local officials and business leaders began preparing for thousands of construction jobs and long-term growth. The Texas National Research Laboratory Commission moved quickly to acquire land and coordinate with federal agencies, tying the region's future to the fate of the collider beneath its soil. Once the site in Texas was selected, the technical blueprint for the collider began to change. Engineers at the SC laboratory reviewed the Central Design Group's original plans, looking for ways to ensure reliability and to reach the ambitious energy targets. One of the first major adjustments involved the superconducting magnets that would steer protons around the ring. Early designs called for a 4-centimeter aperture, but as prototype magnets were tested, it became clear that a 5-centimeter bore was needed to keep the powerful beams stable and to reduce the risk of quenching and to preserve stability. This single change meant larger and heavier magnets, expanded cryogenic systems, and more tunnel space to accommodate the increased hardware. At the same time, the team decided to double the energy of the injector, the separate accelerator that would feed protons into the main ring, moving from a 1 trillion electron volt injector to a 2 trillion electron volt injector. Improved beam quality, but it required longer tunnels, additional infrastructure, and new technical systems. Each refinement promised a more robust collider, yet every improvement added to the demands on construction and resources. By the time these changes were finalized, the scale of the project had quietly grown well beyond what was first imagined. That expansion set the stage for the budget debates that would soon dominate the conversation. The early 1990s brought a new reality to Washington. The Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and the sense of existential competition that had once fueled massive science projects evaporated. Without that old enemy as a backdrop, the political language around national priorities changed. Deficit reduction became a rallying cry in Congress. Lawmakers from both parties began to question every large federal expense, and they scrutinized projects that had once seemed untouchable. The annual budget deficit hovered over $250 billion, and the national debt passed $4 trillion. In this environment, the Superconducting Super Collider was no longer a symbol of American strength, but a line item competing with healthcare, education, and defense. Congressional hearings grew sharper. Members who had lost out in the site selection process now saw little reason to defend the Texas-based project. Questions about value, cost, and necessity replaced earlier talk of prestige. The political mood shifted from expansion to caution, and the Collider's growing price tag became a frequent target for budget hawks. The climate in Washington was no longer about scientific ambition, but about fiscal discipline and hard choices. In 1991, official budget documents from the Department of Energy set the Superconducting Super Collider baseline cost at just over $8.2 billion. That figure was already nearly double the early estimates that had helped win approval, which called the original baseline into question. As construction advanced, independent reviews raised new alarms. The Congressional Budget Office warned that historical patterns suggested costs could climb by as much as 46% beyond the Department of Energy projection. Then, in 1993, a major outside contractor, Scango, delivered an updated estimate of nearly $10 billion, excluding the added expense of a proposed schedule extension that would have pushed the total closer to $11 billion. These numbers did not come from political opponents or critics on the sidelines. They were the product of auditors, analysts, and cost review panels brought in to scrutinize the project's finances. Each new report seemed to widen the gap between what had been promised and what Congress was being asked to fund. The credibility of official projections eroded as lawmakers compared Department of Energy baselines to the higher and increasingly persuasive figures from independent sources. By the time funding decisions reached the appropriations committees, the conversation had shifted. Cost escalation was no longer an abstract risk. It was a documented reality, and it raised urgent questions about how much more the country would be required to spend to finish what it had started. Government auditors and oversight officials began to scrutinize the Superconducting Super Collider with renewed intensity. In 1992, the Government Accountability Office published a report that placed the project's projected cost at nearly $11.8 billion, more than double the original estimate. The report described the cost forecasts as unstable, noting that technical uncertainties and evolving designs left the final price tag open-ended. The Department of Energy Inspector General echoed these concerns, finding that management controls at the Superconducting Super Collider laboratory were incomplete. Early accounting systems could not reliably track spending by project phase, making it difficult to link these to real progress. Auditors flagged improper and questionable charges from contractors, including expenses not clearly tied to collider construction. These findings were read into the congressional record and became central to budget debates. At the same time, the promise of major foreign contributions remained unfulfilled. Despite years of negotiation, no international partner had committed to sharing the financial burden at a scale seen in Europe's CERN projects. The combination of rising costs, weak oversight, and a lack of outside investment gave critics concrete evidence. For lawmakers facing tough budget choices, these reports provided a clear rationale to question whether continued funding could be justified. On October 19, 1993, the House of Representatives voted 264 to 159 to remove all funding for the Superconducting Super Collider from the federal budget. The vote came during the annual appropriations process for the Department of Energy, with the Energy and Water Subcommittee leading the debate. Lawmakers cited the project's rising costs, management problems, and the absence of major international partners as reasons to stop further spending. The Texas delegation, joined by project supporters, argued for continued investment, but a coalition of fiscal conservatives and members from outside Texas prevailed. With this vote, the House set the project on an irreversible course toward cancellation. Conference committee negotiations failed to restore funding for the Superconducting Super Collider. The final version of the Energy and Water Appropriations Act for fiscal year 1994 contained no money for the project. On October 30, 1993, President Clinton signed the bill into law. With his signature, the SSC lost its legal authority to operate. Contracts were suspended and construction stopped immediately. No clause or partial completion protected the project. Annual appropriations had always determined its fate. The shutdown order went out to the Texas laboratory. The Texas National Research Laboratory Commission began the process of dissolving. The world's largest science project came to a halt, not by technical failure, but by the stroke of a pen. Today, the unfinished tunnels beneath Texas are a reminder that national ambition can be undone by shifting priorities and political will. As global investment in science accelerates elsewhere, the fate of the SSC signals what is lost when vision collides with budget and when leadership chooses to walk away.